All right. With that, I'll turn it over to Danny Wade for today's topic.
Cool. Thanks, Nick. Let me go ahead and share my screen and just get confirmation that everything looks all right before we get started. Okay, let me go ahead and switch to the presentation. All right, can you see my slide?
Looks great.
Good.
Cool. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Wade. I'm with NetCraftsmen. I'm a network automation engineer. And today I actually it's going to be a little bit different. This is my first time actually presenting a tool or a technology that kind of I built. I didn't build all of it. Definitely, it's, kudos to the open source community, but it's definitely a first time for me. So any questions you may have, please throw them in the chat and that'll be monitored and we can definitely answer them along the way. So today's topic is Net-textorial. This is a project I've been working on. Really kind of came out of like a pet project, trying to learn new technologies. And the idea of it is to explore structured network data all within your terminal. And you'll kind of get a better feel for what that looks like as we go through the presentation and into the demo. So, uh, quick introduction. I don't like to kind of show or talk too much about myself, but like I mentioned, I'm a network automation engineer at NetCraftsmen. Um, Focused on my current focus really is learning more about software development practices, processes, and tooling. And my past, I have about 5 years of experience with network automation. And just as like a tidbit, I started my network automation journey with Ansible. I know a lot of people are figuring out, do I start with Ansible? Do I start with Python, just pure Python? I always like to just throw in like where I started with, just, hopefully it can maybe point you in a direction or, give you some sort of affirmation of where you may have started. Um, I have some links there to my LinkedIn, GitHub, and my Twitter. All three are good places to find me. So with that, let's just move into Net-textorial. It is published on Cisco's DevNet code exchange. So along with being published on GitHub, um, Cisco DevNet actually provides a repository called Code Exchange that allows you basically submit a project that's hosted on GitHub, open source, that they basically can, show and display within the DevNet community. It syncs up with GitHub, so it's not like any sort of duplicate code, but I did want to put a link there for my code exchange. And then this button, or what you see on screen there, it's very interesting. I've submitted projects in the past, and they normally give you like a nice DevNet published, which you may see in the bottom left here in the screenshot. You might see it's a little badge just saying, hey, the code's published on DevNet. Um, but I found that they actually give you another badge where you can run VS Code, which, as people may know, is kind of an ID um, to edit code, and you can run VS Code in your browser through Cisco DevNet. So I just want to take a quick screenshot of that. It's actually kind of neat. You click on the button and a browser opens and it pops you right into VS Code. So you can actually start looking through the source code, making changes, and testing it right there. And as you can see, the screen's kind of split in half. You'll see that there's the README in the top half, and then in the bottom is the terminal that is the actual program running. And we'll dive more into that, obviously. But I just thought it was a kind of a cool shout out for Cisco DevNet. GitHub also has a feature just like this. You can go to any GitHub repository, and while in the repository in your browser, you can press the period button on your keyboard and it will launch you into a VS Code instance just like this. But thought it was cool to bring up. So now let's dive in. So I always like to start where my motivation or the purpose of the tool came from. So really, it was an idea to provide more approachable hands-on way to teach network engineers the difference between structured and unstructured data, the importance of it, and the differences. And then kind of secondly, and more selfishly, it was just a way or, a purpose for me to build a terminal-based application using a new Python framework called Textual, which we'll jump into. So let's just start out with some basics about what's unstructured and structured data. Unstructured, your human-readable data. It's your output you get if you're in the CLI of any network device. You run a show command, prints that nice little tabular data that you're used to seeing while in an SSH session. That's your unstructured data. Requires manual analysis. I'm sure many of you, if you're troubleshooting a problem, how many people run a show command and then just sift through line by line or have to scroll up and down to find that timer or to find that error, whatever it may be. That's your unstructured data. Structured data, on the other hand, it's computer readable and allows programmatic interactions and analysis. So as you may know, interacting with large swaths of data and being accurate is really only possible through programmatic analysis. Doing manual computations can be very error prone, and really it's just very time consuming. And here's an example of the show IP ARP command. It's one that I think most network engineers can relate to. On the left, you see, hey, that's very easy to read from from a human's perspective. And then on the right side is that structured output that you can write programs, you can write scripts to parse through that. So otherwise, the left, you would have to, if you wanted to, let's say, locate the number 52 right there in the middle in the second row, you'd have to loop through each row. You'd have to find and do regular expressions to parse out that one value. And, as you can see, if it measures in minutes, that value is going to change a minute from now. So that's kind of a struggle when it comes to unstructured data versus on the right side, you have a list of different objects and you could parse through and find that key value pair that you're interested in. So who cares whether the data is structured, right? I told you about the two differences and, oh, this one's requires manual analysis and this one is programmatically, allows you to interact with it programmatically. Well, as we're in a, network automation space, structured data is the foundation to a lot of infrastructure automation, uh, along with other things such as tooling, standards. There's a lot of requirements to kind of keep a good automation framework moving. But having structured data is one of those kind of foundational pieces. And then interacting with structured data just makes your life easier, right? If you're constantly monitoring your network or you're collecting telemetry, having that in a expected format, whether that be Yang data models that you can that is encoded with JSON or XML, there's ways to interact with it versus just globs of network data. Network testing, testing for expected network state. That can involve running a bunch of show commands after a hardware refresh or after a data center migration, whatever that may be. Doing that network testing before and after changes has been always crucial for network engineers. And then lastly, building and pushing configuration changes. This, you can use unstructured data. You could send line by line instructions. However, if you're trying to push this out to a lot of devices and it kind of gets more complex as you build different, what I call features, for example, your BGP configuration versus your OSPF configuration versus your SNMP and logging configuration. If you could build that into structured data sets and then push them out to devices at will, then you at least have kind of that helps you standardize on those configurations without losing line by line configurations. So where exactly does my project fit into all this, right? I just went through and kind of give you a mini tutorial on structured data. So Net-textorial, which I know is a mouthful, it's basically a learning or reference tool for network engineers to explore structured data that's parsed from their network devices. Because I think the one thing, everyone tries to start out with network automation is, oh, I just want to push config, right? Here's my code that I want to push. Let's push it out to every network device. Where my tool comes in, and it kind of helps teach network engineers, traditional network engineers, the value of what structured data looks like and what it looks like versus what you're used to in unstructured data. And then the second point, it is considered a TUI app. And yes, that is an acronym for a terminal-based user interface application. And I'll dive into that more as we move through the presentation. Here's a quick screenshot of the interface. I will be demoing it here actually in a couple minutes, but I wanted just to show you kind of what the interface looks like when you first launch. You may be interested to see, hey, this is inside a terminal. And yes, it is. There's a text box. There are two columns, left and right, for raw output and parsed output. And then along the bottom, you actually have some hotkeys and buttons for quit, to copy the output, and then to copy the parsed output. So you actually have a full built-in user interface in your terminal, hence the TUI acronym, terminal-based user interface. And you can see this is what it looks like in action. So I'll be using an always-on DevNet sandbox today. It's just a Cisco CSR 1000V. And then you plug in the host name and you provide the command, the show command, and you'll see on the left side is what you're used to in the terminal output, when you're SSH to the device. And then the right is your parsed output, what gets transformed using different parsers. And I'll dive into that as well. So let's actually take a quick look at what this tool looks like. So I figure I'll do a demo now. We'll go through kind of what it could look like and what it does, and then we'll dive into what's kind of under the hood, what's powering the tool. And that way, as you see the demo, you may also have questions since you've seen it in action. And as we dive into the details, you may have, it might spark some additional questions. So let me go ahead and pull up my terminal. So as I mentioned, textual is the library that's used, and we'll dive into that after the demo here. But I wanted to just make a point is, you might be seeing how well, actually, let me go ahead and get this up and running first. So you might be like, wow, the graphics look very nice. The colors are clean. So for Mac users, they actually recommend to download a separate terminal that's not the default Mac terminal. So I'm using iTerm 2. It's a very popular one. I mean, at least amongst the people I know using Macs. Windows, they actually, the framework maintainer actually mentions that the Windows terminal, not the command prompt, but the Windows terminal, I think that's default now in Windows 10 and 11. That actually has the built-in colors and everything needed to make it look really nice. And then Linux, kind of the same thing. You could use the default terminal for that. I just wanted to make that known, just in case you do, clone down the code and use the code, and then it comes out and the colors don't look good and the format's a little different. I just wanted to provide that kind of that disclaimer. So moving on. So we'll take a look at, let me actually go ahead and get the device data. And before we actually look, this is the user interface. Let me go ahead and get the device details. So as I said, I'm actually using a always on Cisco CSR 1000V. So I'm actually just going to copy the host name here. In order to store the credentials, the way that it's currently built is setting environment variables. And I already have those set here, and I'll show you those right now. So basically, you would set the username and the password using these environment variable names, net-text-user and net-text-pass. The way you could set those is you would just type export net-text-user and then equals, and then, username, admin, or whatever. In this case, the username is developer, the password Cisco12345, but you would do an export and it would save it as an environment variable for your current session. So just wanted to throw out there, that's how you set the credentials. That is all in the README as well within the source code, and the GitHub link is at the end of the presentation. So no need to write it down. It's all within the README. So we have the host name, we have the credentials set. Now we just need to run a couple commands. So we'll paste, and let's just do a show version. So you can see I just did the host name, type show version. I just press enter. It looks like the screen has froze. This is a synchronous action currently, so it really does hold up a CPU cycle, and you kind of have to wait for it to load, versus async, where you could shoot it off and it can run as a kind of on a thread or in kind of background process, and it doesn't hold up the interface. But this is kind of a synchronous. Currently, the way it's just configured is it's a synchronous action, so you do have to wait for it to load. And you can see here, you have the raw output on the left, and this is what you're used to seeing in your terminal when you're SSH to a device. And then on the right is actually what the parse output would look like. For the parsing, we're using NTC templates, or the network to code templates. We'll dive into those here in a later slide, but the importance here is you could see the difference between the raw and the parsed output, right? You can quickly see the version, the host name, the uptime. So that's actually a pretty good example. Looking at the uptime, 10 hours, 18 minutes, it may only take you 2 seconds to see that in this output. You see line 21, the uptime is 10 hours, 18 minutes. But let's say you're doing that across thousands of devices and you have to be accurate across every device. It's much easier to run this command, parse it, and collect all this parsed output, and you could very quickly find that uptime number. So that's just one small example of what the difference between unstructured and structured data, and the key of being able to just quickly extract values, and in a very assuming way. So beyond the output, you'll see that we have a few buttons down here. These technically could be buttons, and they're also binded to the keys. So I could press the letter Q on my keyboard to quit, or I could click on the quit button down here. So these are kind of hotkeys as well. So I actually copied some output already and put it in VS Code, because the nice part is, especially it being advertised as a learning tool, maybe you want to copy the output of each and then parse through it using Notepad++, or in my case, VS Code, to look through the data a little more. So I'm going to pull up VS Code, and I have a couple outputs saved here. So let me go ahead and actually zoom in on this. So, all right. So you can see that, VS Code kind of helps you, does some different syntax highlighting, and then you can see, there's some rainbow indentation. When the data set's this small, it's really like there's nothing really fun to look at. However, I actually just discovered this VS Code extension earlier today. It's called JSON Crack. I don't know where the name came from, but when you click on, when you use it, it actually helps visualize the data for you. So you can see, let me see if I can zoom in here. There we go. So you can see this is kind of that same data set. And then you can also see specific keys that can have multiple values are broken out. And you can see the different numbers here, or I'm sorry, the different values. If a value can have multiple, or I'm sorry, a key can have multiple values by the braces, right? And that is just common for kind of a list. But in this case, we only have one value. However, there's a possibility of having multiple. So, hardware serial, multiple serial numbers could be from, for example, a switch stack. And so you can imagine this serial key having multiple values. But I thought this VS Code extension really helped a little bit, helped visualize kind of what this data could be. I have some other interesting ones real quick before we kind of get back to discussion. So I actually ran one for show IP interfaces, and I'll actually just run that real quick on here so you can see what it looks like. Show IP interfaces. I think it's show IP interfaces. So I pressed enter, waiting for it to load. In this time, it's going out to the device, retrieving, and you can see, actually, I think it was interface. We'll see. But in this time that we're sitting here waiting, okay, there we go. It's going out, connecting to the device, gathering all the output on the left here, and then it's also parsing through this data using our set of NTC parsers we have in the background. So you can see, so this is a good example, right, of a bunch of unstructured data and having to sift through it and find the exact information you're looking for, right? And yes, you can use show IP interface brief, and they do make some shorter commands, but you can see over 200 lines of output here. On the right, there's each of these interfaces, right, are now broken down into the interface name, the link status, protocol status, the IP address assigned to it, the mask, the MTU, and then if there's an IP helper address and ACLs assigned. So you can see it's much easier. In this case, it's actually a little easier to read. However, there is some more data in here. So for example, like IPsef being enabled, like that's not shown in the parsed output, right? So there are different things depending on how the parser was built that may not be shown. But to show you what this looks like real quick, we'll just use, this is that same parsed output I just showed you. We'll click on JSON crack, and you can see the, once again, not anything visually appealing. You can see how they break out the different interfaces, the IP address for each interface, the mask for each IP address. But it's cool. It helps you visualize the data. There's other. This isn't the only extension. I don't want to also promote this extension as like this is the end all be all. There's plenty of other open online tools as well where you can plug in JSON data, and you can then view that output and visualize it like they have it here. So I just like using this tool because one, I just found it today and it does exactly what I'm looking for. So one last structure piece that I actually found, it took me a little bit to find something that would be interesting, especially with the always on sandbox that has some restrictions because it is read only. I'll show you this. This is show logging. So this actually, it shows a bunch of log messages with a severity of 5. And you can see how big this, you can see all the different log messages here, right? So you can see the severity was 5, and it's the same message with the same severity and the same mnemonic here, but you can see the login success and then the individual log messages here. So just once again, another way to visualize that parse data as you're learning. All right, so let's get back to the slides here. And we can always open up that demo back once we, hit the end, or if there's any questions. I want to jump into kind of what's under the hood of this tool. So as I mentioned, TUI, it's a terminal-based user interface. It uses the textual library, which we'll go into in a second. The device connection handling is all done using, I think, a lot of people's favorite network automation library, NetMiko. And then the data parsing is done using NTC templates. And like I said, there's network to codes templates, and we'll dive into those as well, kind of explaining what that means. So what is a TUI? As I mentioned, terminal or text-based user interface. Here's some cool benefits that's on the frameworks README or read the docs. Rapid development, it's all built on Python. Very low requirements, you only need a terminal. It's cross-platform, runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. You can run it remotely over SSH, and it's open source with the MIT license. And the bonus for us, network engineers love their terminals, right? We're not telling you, hey, go to a browser, make sure it's HTTPS. Like it's not a web app. This is right in your terminal. So Textual, it's a framework built to build TUI apps. It was built by Will McGugan. He also built the famous Rich library. If you're a Python developer, you probably know the Rich library by now. And then the texture, and then he recently, I shouldn't say recently, this past year, he's built out a company called Textualize and has hired developers to help him build out this textual framework. The textual framework uses rich library objects, also called renderables, to build interfaces. So these TUI apps are all built on the idea of what's called a widget. And a widget is made up of rich renderables, right? So syntax, table, and text are some examples. To go back actually real quick, just to show you the just to show you kind of what's built here. So this is a widget here, the input. This is where you could type in the text, and then the left, each box, each output is a syntax object, or sorry, a syntax widget, which is a syntax renderable. And that's why you can see like the color code, or I'm sorry, the highlighting of some of the text, right, for the numbers. You can see the line numbers and just overall how it's kind of more of it's not your standard just text object, right? It looks like something where code belongs. It's all designed around kind of that's why it's a separate, it's called a syntax widget, because the line numbers, and it helps with some of the code, making it look nice, and that syntax highlighting. So just wanted to relate it back to the application. All right, let's go. And then lastly, it's actually inspired by some modern web development. It uses CSS for all of its styling. And that was kind of a newer addition actually in October. He released a new release. You're able to create a CSS style sheet and actually design and do your shading, your borders, all of that through CSS, which if you're a web developer, you know CSS pretty well. So I think that's kind of neat. CSS is definitely, some people like it, some people hate it. But I think it's cool that he didn't kind of build um, his own styling system. It's based on, web development. Moving on to the device connection handling, NetMiko, built by Kirk Myers. This is straight from their site. It's a multi-vendor library to simplify those CLI connections to your network devices. It's based on Paramiko, which is a popular SSH library, and it handles everything from sending the commands to receiving the commands, all those in between, creating those channels. NetMiko takes care of that. And then lastly, data parsing are your NTC templates. It's an open source library. It just has a bunch of text FSM templates. That's what they're called. Text FSM is a Python module. It's built by Google to parse semi-formatted text, right? And that's exactly what we're looking at here, right? It's semi-formatted. For example, the IP ARP table I showed in the very beginning, that screenshot, it's in a tabular format. It's just semi-formatted. It's not structured though, right? It is semi-formatted. So text FSM can have its own syntax within building its parsers, but each text FSM template is a parser. So you can look at the network to code templates. I have links all in this slideshow, so you can see they get updated. I don't want to say frequently, but they do get updated and there are new ones created. And I actually wanted to throw in a quick opinion. I know I like to just throw in some things I've learned along the way. Kind of my first contribution to an open source project was actually building a parser for the Genie library, the Genie parser library, which is part of Cisco and the PyATS project. But I honestly think building or modifying parsers, it's a very easy starting point if you want to contribute to open source. I know one of the first things I looked at, I was like, oh, contribute to open source. Let me take a look at the Django project or like one of these large projects, and you quickly get lost in understanding like where you're at. Because it really is, it's just too much to take on all at once. That kind of one step at a time. So building and modifying parsers, you take that raw output and use a little bit of regex, or in this case, build a text FSM template. It really helps you understand, kind of how to transform that raw data into structured data. And it's pretty easy to, I wouldn't say easy to accomplish, but it really depends on the command, right? There's some commands or some parsers that look for one piece of data in that raw output, and it provides that as that parse data. So it really is up to you and what you're looking for from that parsed output. So yeah, my message is if you are looking to get into open source and you're a network engineer and you'd like to contribute in some way because you love these libraries like NetMiko or Scrapply or anything like that, take a look at just building or modifying a parser that's out there. Whether it be NTC templates or the Genie parser library from Cisco, it really is a good place to start, in my opinion. Kind of wrapping up, looking at the future and future enhancements for this tool. Looking at a way to integrate credential handle a credential store. So HashiCorp Vault is a very popular way to have an integration point where you may already have your credentials stored. So instead of you creating those environment variables that I mentioned in the beginning, maybe we just integrate with where your credentials store now. And then that kind of moves on to the second point, which is plugging into an existing inventory system or a source of truth, such as an Autobot or Netbox, or anything, anything that has an API or something that you're able to extract data from. The idea is so that way you don't have to plug in just one host name. Maybe you have you're typing out a host name and it has an auto recommendation, right? You're typing for a New York City, right? You have a New York City location, you type NYC, and then there's a drop down that recommends all of your your NYC devices, right? So that sort of thing I'm kind of looking at as well, being able to support a plugin system to say, all right, I would like to connect to my Autobot instance. Here's the URL, here's some credentials, and then it reads an inventory from your Autobot instance. It would obviously wouldn't do updates or anything like that. The idea is to reduce the duplication of work, and that's really where both points come through. Uh, that way you don't have, if you have a big credential store somewhere, I don't want you to have to go through and export and create environment variables for all your credentials again. And then same thing with your inventory. If you have a full inventory, thousands of devices, and you want to run this tool against all of them or some of them, I want you to be able to sync with that source of truth or that inventory system. And lastly, or almost lastly, this is just highlighting, check out the Cisco DevNet Code Exchange. It has a link to the GitHub as well. But I know a lot of people do go there to see kind of some cool projects that are going on in the network automation DevNet community. So it is out there. And definitely let me know if you have any questions. And that kind of leads into the last piece. So the code repository, that's the GitHub link. You can go directly to the GitHub. Please, if you find issues, I tried doing as much as I can with, error handling and that sort of thing. I've had some success testing against Cisco devices and Juniper devices, but if you download the code and you get it up and running, the tool supports anything that NetMiko supports as far as device platforms, and NetMiko has a really good documentation on what they support device-wise. But that's all I have. Really, I'm open to questions or Nick.
So Danny, VS Code been a big proponent of that because of all of the extensibility. What prompted you? What are some of the extensions that you like to use, and what prompted you to look for the extension that you showed us today?
Oh, I kind of just so to answer the second question first, the extension I used today, I kind of just ran into it today. um, I've always kind of looked for things to make my life easier. I mean, obviously the structured data, it's kind of easy to look at, but when you start getting into really nested data, it gets a little tougher. And some of the examples I showed today, they really don't do it justice. But some other extensions I like. I guess let me just pop up my VS Code here. Let me see. I have a Docker extension, and I have actually a really good one is the Remote Explorer, where you actually can SSH to another device, or I'm sorry, a VM. You can SSH into a Docker container. I know on Windows you can or not SSH, but you can log into your WSL instance. I know a lot of people on Windows develop in the WSL environment, and so you can connect your VS Code into that environment. So you're kind of in a native Linux environment, but yeah, I would say the remote execution one, the SSH one, is probably my most used, I'd guess. Any other questions?
The one I've got
How,
is
go ahead.
I've spent a lot of time over the years teaching programmability concepts to traditional engineers, and I think a really interesting use, and I don't know if you've thought about this, would be helping them, as you've in the tool shown them the unstructured data and the structured data, add
Yeah.
the capability to let them key into um, the kind of parsing down the JSON output, right? So, uh, kind of giving people the ability to teach how to parse JSON and go through and use the UI to highlight if you're looking for this value in a list, right? Using these keys, these values, and then you could render some overlay color or something like that on the right side. I think would be an interesting way to kind of potentially drive home some concepts where you could teach people how to filter on some of that content that's returned as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You mentioned the source of truth.
Yep.
Be interesting to take a look at diff sync that NTC's developed that
Okay.
does diffs. Is there some integration between your output and what diff sync does? I haven't a clue as to whether there's some association there. Just struck me as, okay, is there a way to diff, say, a real world device, which you're pulling data from, and a source of truth?
Yeah, I mean, we have the data. I mean, that's the best part. It's just syncing with that source of truth, and that's where I see this tool moving to. So I just to kind of talk about where I'm looking for improvements. So they have an idea, so I can actually build out my ideas. I'm gonna pop out. There's a menu like pop out that you can build in to where it's hidden most of the time, and then you click on a button and it kind of pops out here on the left side, and you could have like the different source of truth, like select from this drop down, Autobot, Netbox, whatever it may be, and we could build those capabilities, and then you could do sync, or you can do um, any. We have, like I said, we can have a way to store the data that we're collecting and then sync it to one of those tools you described. So. Um, but yeah, right now everything's kind of ran in memory, right? So that's another thing to consider. There's no database on the back end. None of this information is being stored per se. Um, but that's very easy, something we could add in because we're getting the data and we store it in memory, but we haven't built out a back end infrastructure or anything like that. But I totally could see that happening in the future.
An IPAM integration to be able to take the output for your parsed output and see if it's in whatever IPAM system you have and highlight the ones that aren't, or enrich the data with what is in the IPAM system would be a nice feature as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see this being used for some diagnostics where you run against a particular device and then it does an automatic comparison against your source of truth or an IPAM and highlights for you the things that are different. It's like, oh, well, how did that change?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Kind of doing a diff and showing that. Yeah, this is yeah, all good points.
Hey Danny, have you thought about trying to add support for like Scrappily?
So yeah, that's a good point, Colby. I actually meant to talk about this, so thank you for reminding me. Yeah, so right now, the reason NetMiko is used is because it kind of it can help handle all the parsing and determine the device type. So as you saw, and this is kind of starting to dive into the secrets of the back end of the tool. I didn't have to plug in and say, hey, this is a Cisco iOS XE device, or this is a. I didn't have to do that because that's another cool feature. NetMiko has this plugin that basically it's called the SSH Auto Detect module, and it will figure out the device type. So that's kind of the main reason that I'm using NetMiko. I wouldn't see a reason to move to Scrapply. I know, Scrapply's faster, right? Quote unquote faster. They do have, I know they have like an async component with Scrapply. I know there's an async library, I believe, that I would look at. So I don't know if I would move to it as it currently stands, but I'd definitely be open to it. One other consideration I was thinking of is integrating Genie parsers. So right now, the NTC template library is great, but there's definitely some differences between that and the available Genie parsers. So being able to add more parsers to the library and to parse against. So for example, if this command here, show IP interface, didn't have an available parser in the NTC template library, then it would just say no parser available. But could we also look it up in the Genie library as well, right? Kind of have that second eye on it. So I would probably look at the parser libraries, to add that in the future. But yeah, I'm not against Scrapply. It's just NetMiko works for what I'm doing right now.
Of course, and I actually advocate for potentially adding Genie as well, because personally, I would like to compare the two structured outputs. I know that Genie tends to be more nested, but sometimes NTC templates is great as well. So it'd be really cool to kind of toggle between the two different types of output, pick whatever model we want to use.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I was kind of thinking, and this is just spitballing again, right here at the top, kind of having two tabs, right? NTC templates and then Genie parsers, and you just click on the different tabs to see the different outputs.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
what I'm imagining as well.
maybe do a diff or, like you said, a comparison between the two parsed outputs to see what is different, right? If it's for the same command, like I know show IP route, right? That's a very popular command. I'm sure there's some sort of differences between the two parsers available. Any other questions? I thought I may have seen one in the chat pop up, but I'm not sure. Might have just been a comment, but
It doesn't look like there's any questions in the chat currently.
Gotcha.
Anybody else? Otherwise, we can give everybody some time back and go from there.
Great job, Danny. I really appreciate you taking the time to put this together for us. It's been very useful.
Yeah, not a problem. And thank you for the opportunity to share it at the meetup. So this was fun.
Yeah, thanks again to everybody that if you did or didn't see the chat, I dropped some links in there to the community page on wwt.com. I will, as soon as I get the recording off of WebEx, I'll get the recording and the link to the presentation, a link to the repo, everything posted there. And then we've been live streaming to YouTube, so the recording will live on the YouTube side as well. So thanks again. The tool is really cool. I see a lot of opportunity for it, especially in just getting people into infrastructure automation, especially from a network engineering standpoint. It's always an interesting conversion to get people to buy into programmability for that. So thanks again. And with that, to everybody that joined, thank you. We'll probably have another session sometime in January. So hope to see you then.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick.